So if you go to read a textbook, Introduction to International Relations, which we used to train first-year students, or any literature, like, even advanced study of international relations, you will find that a lot of the material is sourced from European history or American practice. There is very little about in those textbooks about how other societies or civilizations or states like say India or China, which are much older civilizations than many Western civilizations, how they contributed their ideas, their concepts. So that's basically if you talk about what I call the traditional international relations, TIR, said, let's put it. That's what the textbooks draw on. That's what the textbooks present. Global international relations, the GIR, does a much broader job. It doesn't neglect or dismiss the contributions of Western societies or the traditional IR. But it says that's not enough. That's very narrow, that's very parochial, and that's no longer, it's kind of out of date.
Welcome everyone to this new episode of The Next Page, our podcast designed to advance the conversation on multilateralism. Today we have with us through video link Professor Amitav Acharya, who has written, studied, and lectured extensively on international relations, both the history and the development and evolution of international relations. And we're going to be talking with him about how IR, international relation, is evolving, what we can look at in terms of its future at this crucial moment where we all agree multilateralism is in urgent need of an upgrade. Professor Acharya, welcome to our podcast. Thank you for taking the time. Let me just say that you are UNESCO Chair of Transnational Challenges and Governance and Distinguished Professor at the School of International Service, American University in Washington, D.C., from which you are joining us today. And previously, you were a professor at York University, Toronto, and the University of Bristol in the UK. You also are Honorary Professor at Rhodes University, South Africa, and Guest Professor at Nankai University in China. Welcome. Thank you so very much, Professor. Why don't you introduce yourself to our audience so they get to know you a little bit better?
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to this podcast. So you already introduced me. So I am based in Washington, although I'm speaking from my home rather than from my office in the university. So I did also have other experiences as a professor or in teaching and research. Aside from the positions that you mentioned, I'm actually a professor of practice of transnational governance at the SOAS University at the moment. I also taught in Singapore. My early career was actually at the National University of Singapore and then a little later at the Nanyang Technological University. And I have been a visiting professor at Oxford University, at Harvard University, Kennedy School of Government, and in Richumakan University in Japan, and Chulalongkorn University in Thailand, among others. So I like to stress that I was born in India. I did my doctoral studies, spent a bit of my youth in Australia, and then I've worked in Canada, Singapore, Britain, and now the United States.
Well, that's already an impressive career. Professor Acharya, let's begin by setting the scene. In several of your articles and books, you argue quite strongly that the peculiar conditions upon which IR was built and developed in the early stages, and in which saw a dominance of Western values and Western history in international relations, that peculiar moment is coming to an end. And therefore, IR needs to adjust and evolve and embrace additional modernized cultures, to use your terminology. So let's set the scene. Why do we need to do this? Why do we need to broaden the analysis and the way we look at IR today?
So let me start by saying that we are talking here about two very closely related but slightly distinctive sort of things here. One is international relations, or IR, as a discipline, as a field of study that people, especially those who are in diplomacy and international relations fields, they have to train themselves in. Not all of them, but many of them. And then there is the international relations in practice. The practitioners who may not be studying international relations in theory, but still have to deal with the substance of the field on a daily basis. So my work has been primarily directed towards the field, because I am a professor of international relations, but I also have always an eye and ear for what happens in the field. So a lot of my work is also policy relevant, not all. So I am very conscious of the fact, and this is the reason why I got into this field, and also the debate about broadening and redefining IR, is that a lot of what we use as our textbooks in training diplomats or training anybody who wants to have a career in international relations. There could be NGOs, there could be people who, in the media. They get a training that is very Eurocentric, that sort of thinks of the beginning of international relations as having started from Europe and then kind of developed in the United States. So international relations is sometimes called as American social science because it was born in Europe, born in UK, and raised in the US. Now, what happens to the rest of the world? The rest of the world gets a very small space and sometimes even marginalized, and not only neglected, but marginalized. In a way, that is no longer sustainable because the world is changing. International relations, if you want to put a date on it, was born as a field in 1919 when the first chair of what was called chair of international politics, was called Woodrow Wilson chair of international politics, was established at what was the University of Wales in Aberystwyth, now called Aberystwyth University. So that's just over 100 years old. But the field of the subject matter of international relations was not born 100 years ago. What we study, like diplomacy, cooperation, peace, negotiations, moral ideas and norms, freedom of navigation. Those things were not invented 100 years ago. They were invented hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and they were not invented only in Europe. Far from it. Many of the key ideas came out of the Middle East, like the idea of empire, the idea of the first peace treaty between the Hittites and the Egyptians, the Treaty of Cádiz. There is so much history that can tell you that the subject of international relations, the themes of international relations was not born in one region or certainly not in one country. They predate even the creation of the United States, the rise of the West. So my main concern has been to try to reclaim that broader terrain and try to develop an approach, which I call global international relations, that looks at the voices and experiences and the histories of the entire humankind and not just the modern Europe or the United States. That's what has been driving my thinking and my research to make international relations relevant to the 21st century at a time when we're not living in the era of European dominance, although the West remains very, very important. We're not dismissing their contribution. But at the same time, there's so many other places, other civilizations, other nations that have contributed to what diplomats, practitioners have to know and what academics have to teach and develop through the research. That has to be brought front and center to make this subject of international relations relevant for the 21st century.
And I hope we will have time during this episode of the podcast to go deeper into your knowledge of how these different parts of the world contributed to what amounts today to international relations. But before we go there, let's stay a little bit longer on the theoretical part. You just mentioned the term global international relations. So what does it mean for our practitioners? Global international relations versus international relations. Could you tell us more?
Yeah. So let's start by talking about textbooks. So if you go to read a textbook, Introduction to International Relations, which we use to train first-year students, or any literature, like even advanced study of international relations, you will find that a lot of the material is sourced from European history or American practice. There is very little in those textbooks about how other societies or civilizations or states like, say, India or China, which are much older civilizations than many Western civilizations, how they contributed their ideas, their concepts. So that's basically if you talk about what I call the traditional international relations, TIR, let's put it. That's what the textbooks draw on. That's what the textbooks present. Global international relations, the GIR, does a much broader job. It doesn't neglect or dismiss the contributions of Western societies or the traditional IR. But it says that's not enough. That's very narrow, that's very parochial, and that's no longer, it's kind of out of date. It's past its use-by date. So global international relations broadens the field. It goes back in history and also in practice, because there are a lot of things happening even today in Africa, in Latin America, in Middle East, in the Islamic world, in Asia, in China, India, that are actually not even reflected in our textbooks, even though they deal with modern concepts and modern events. So global international relations goes back in history, but also draws from contemporary thinking and practices in, say, the non-Western world, and then brings them into the syllabi, the research outputs, and the conversations, the debates of international relations. So it's broader, much broader. It's attentive to both the West and the rest, and it sometimes, focuses on what you call the neglected, marginalized contributions and voices from the non-West, even in a self-conscious way, so that people know so much about the West and the Western history. People know so much about Greek and Roman history, but how many mainstream people, especially in the universities in the West, for example, when they teach international relations, look at Chinese history or Indian history or Islamic history. So global international relations sort of fills that gap. So therefore, it sort of extends traditional international relations without dumping it and rebooting the sort of our knowledge completely. I said these other knowledge is out there, and sometimes it's actually far more important. It can actually help us to make sense of even the traditional international relations.
And I wonder if we go from this theoretical perspective to a more practice perspective, one concept that I came across in your books and articles was this concept of deep pluralism to sort of describe the kind of transformation that is going on right now in the practice of multilateralism and international relations. So this almost, dynamic by which the periphery tends to become the new core. And so I wonder if you could share this with our audience, and clarifying a little bit the meaning of deep pluralism.
Yeah. So mindful that I'm speaking to both a practitioner audience and an academic audience, but I think for practitioners, what I'm going to say is more relevant to the practitioners. The deep pluralism is kind of derived from what is called the English School of International Relations. This is a body of literature, originally came out of Britain, but it is fairly global now, although it doesn't have the same kind of following as say more well-known theories like realism or liberalism or constructivism. But still, it's an important term. So pluralism, of course, means, dictionary meaning. There's have more voices, more actors, and more sources of information and sources of contribution to international relations. But it also kind of negates the idea that there is one world or a kind of global village. It sort of thinks diversity or difference is something not to be afraid of. It's a fact of life. So what we need to find out is to find common ground. Now, sometimes in the original formulation of pluralism in the literature and English school, it was seen as something anti or against what is called solidarism. So you have pluralism and solidarism. Solidarism is more cooperative. So solidarism means more cooperation. Pluralism means more autonomy of the actors. So more like sovereignty and more like individualistic approaches to international relations. But I think in my work and my own work and my work with Professor Barry Bazan, we do quite accept that rigid separation. Deep pluralism can mean the world is becoming deeply anarchic, everybody for itself, so to speak. I don't think that's the sense here. We basically are trying to say, and certainly that's my understanding and my interpretation, that you cannot ignore diversity. You cannot even condemn diversity. Diversity is not only a fact of life, but it's maybe a good thing because this idea that we are all becoming a global village, however idealistic it may sound, however universalistic and nice it may sound, it's not really going to happen in practice. But that doesn't mean we cannot have cooperation. So what we need to do is to find ways to reconcile this diversity, accept and acknowledge diversity, but try to manage, if not overcome it, to create cooperation and multilateralism. So this also goes back to kind of what is called universalism. Universalism is an Enlightenment term associated with like Western thinkers like Immanuel Kant. But sometimes universalism in the Western sense means one size fits all. Everybody thinks like this, everybody acts like this in a certain way. And if you don't, there's just universal standard everybody must aspire to. Once it was called the standard of civilization. So the idea of what is rational, what is effective. There is a standard that was set in Europe, and the rest of the world has to aspire to it. Otherwise, you are not civilized. Now, that is no longer acceptable, and that's never been true anyway. What global IR tries to do is to overcome that sense of sort of pluralism for its own sake and say that, we are different. Humankind have different voices, different experiences. That doesn't mean we are all humans after all. So we also try to find similar solutions to similar problems. So this unity in diversity is actually not a theoretical proposition. It's actually what people try to do, and especially if they want to try to avoid conflict. So the idea of using deep pluralism is to make people conscious that pluralism doesn't necessarily mean everyone for himself or herself, but acknowledging that we are different, but we are also similar, and we should manage their diversity. And it can be managed. So global IR in some ways is a way of acknowledging diversity, but also trying to overcome diversity.
How do we fit into this perspective the phenomenon of colonialism and the traces that post-colonialism and the resentment that goes with it has left in international relations all the way to the present day? In some of your articles, this is discussed, and I would like for you to tell a little bit about the interlink between the concept of global IRs, the pluralism, and post-colonialism, because I think it's very important.
So colonialism, of course, is a very powerful force because it affected most of the globe. There are very few territories, segments of the world as we know today, which was not affected by colonialism. And there were more people lived under colonial rule in the 19th and early 20th century than they lived in the colonial, the states that colonized the rest of the world. So colonialism is a fact of life. It's a very large fact of life and of international relations. So how do we deal with that in international relations? Some of the early literature on international relations theory basically neglected colonialism. So they basically argue, I'm giving you a general sense, that the current international system that we have is kind of based and originated in Europe and developed in the United States. And, and all the concepts and categories that came from the European state system, like balance of power or cooperation among great powers, to norms and ideas, they all basically were extrapolated from this Western origins to the global scale. But it neglected not only the voices of the colonized people, but also the dark side of colonialism. Again, you can go back and take a look at some of the early literature on international relations, textbooks and writings. Very few of them really mention colonialism. So it didn't exist. That has changed, and there's a body of scholarship, a growing body of scholarship that looks at we can call it post-colonial or decolonial scholarship that really gives a lot of focus to this colonial legacy and heritage of international relations. But it's not enough. It hasn't gone, because it hasn't really gone deep into, it has not transformed the discipline of international relations. So when you study international relations in the colleges and universities, they may have a week of stuff on colonialism or post-colonialism, post-colonial theories of IR, for example. But most of it is about the traditional international relations, very Eurocentric, Americanocentric writings of international relations. So we haven't really come to terms with. International relations as a field of study has not come to terms with the effects of colonialism, and there's a lot more needs to be done. Well, how do we do it is a matter of debate, but I think generally we need to acknowledge, international relations to acknowledge that colonialism is a very big part of the origins and evolution of international relations as a field of study. Even when the first share of international relations was being established a little over a century ago, there was not much attention given to issues of colonialism, racism, or racist geopolitics at that time. And while some progress have been made in filling those gaps, not enough has been done to acknowledge the colonial and racist origins of international relations. And I'm not saying that because as an activist, but as an academic, I think we are better off knowing more about these issues, about the colonial legacy, the movements of national liberation, independence, and also about the idea of the contribution of those countries that are under colonial rule to our thinking about international relations.
But I think this is a perfect segue, Professor, to go into a little bit of more analytical discussion of exactly those contributions. If we are to rethink the history, concept, and theories of modern IR, as you say in so many of your articles, then we have to go around the world and sort of reassemble these contributions. So I would like to guide us through around the world, actually, and enlighten us on these contributions that have been, well, I think the use neglected, the term neglected could be used here, in the historiography of international relations. So how do we go about rethinking all of that? And what are the contributions of other civilizations, if we want to call them, or other countries, other people?
Yeah, so that's a excellent question. It's a big question. It's a profound question. And the work on this, identifying the sources and now from different parts of the world is not complete. So we here means myself and Professor Barry Buzan of now Emeritus from London School of Economics. We published a book last year called Reimagining International Relations, and we looked at the contributions of three civilizations, India, China, and Islam. And we looked at what ideas we can get from those civilizations. And before that, we had published another book called The Making of Global International Relations. Both are published by Cambridge University Press. The earlier book, 2019 book, The Making of Global International Relations, was about how the discipline of international relations evolved and how it was enriched by contributions from, again, Asia, like India and China and Japan, from the Islamic world, from Africa, from Latin America, and not just from Europe or United States. So bringing this all together, one could find, and again, there is some more work I am doing. I'm writing a much wider book, especially looking at the history of world order, coming from the Sumerian civilization to the present. So it gives you all this work will show and has shown and will show when all of this is published that the basic ideas and approaches of international relations have multiple global points of origin. Now, some of these points overlapped. Some of these origins interacted. They were linked. So one civilization learned from another, but some of them are done independently of each other. So to get a sense of the subject of international relations today, we have to really go into the origins from a very historical vantage point. So the thing is, many of us now, when they talk about the concepts of international relations, they go into Westphalia, Peace of Westphalia, 17th century, and the nation states. So international relations revolves around this Westphalian nation state system. That's kind of the main concept around which the field develops. But what about systems that are not Westphalian, that are pre-Westphalian? The vast majority or the most important concepts through the long period of history is not Westphalian sovereign state. Based on Westphalian sovereign state. They're actually based on either divine monarchy or empire or like the hierarchical systems like the Chinese tributary system. So if you study international relations, why we focus on the last 300 years of Westphalia or 400 years and not the 4,000 years of history where we have many different types of political systems and international systems. Now, if you broaden international relations back to 4,000 or 5,000 years, you'll see that many different concepts and approaches to order building has come up. And some of them remain relevant. Agreed that today we live in a Westphalian system, but not all systems are anarchic in the sense of the Westphalian system. There are a lot of variations. In some regions, there is a hierarchical system. Some countries still think in terms of hierarchies rather than equality. Equality may be theoretically good, but in reality, we live in a very hierarchical world. So going back into history, looking at systems that are pre-Westphalian actually helps. And you find that, the idea of empire, where did it come from? The first empire was not the Roman Empire, far from it. It was, grew out of Akkad, but also developed by Assyrians, and then perfected by Persians. The Persian Empire was the first universal empire, and then the Maurya Empire before the Roman Empire came. So look at the hierarchical systems, look at the origins of empire, which is by far not a dead concept. The legacy of hierarchy that came of empire lives on. Similarly, I'll give you another dramatic example. We talk about freedom of seas. Freedom of seas, freedom of oceans is a very important concept for international law. And we often attribute it to Hugo Grotius and sometimes to the Mediterranean. But to cut a long story short, there is a long tradition of freedom of seas in the Indian Ocean that goes back to 1,000 years at least, where anybody could trade in the Indian Ocean by just paying the customs duties. So, in fact, if you look at the 15th century Malacca, which is now a place in Malaysia, it was one of the major trading centers of the Indian Ocean. And Indian Ocean was the largest oceanic trading system in the world. This is before the European discovery or so-called voyage to the Americas. So that created transatlantic trade, a robust transatlantic trade. And Pacific was never really linked in trade those days either. So Indian Ocean was the largest trading network in the world for a long time. And that trade there was more or less free because in Asian societies, the sea was never considered to be part of your territory. Sea was open to everybody. It's like a global common, and trade was regulated, rule-based, but not enforced by a single empire. There was no single empire covering the entire Indian Ocean, unlike the Roman Empire, which could create free trade by controlling the entire Mediterranean and turning this into a Roman sea. But Indian Ocean was nobody's sea. But there was trade, there was regulated trade, there were specific rules about how much customs you pay, how many days you can stay in a port. So to me, if you want to look at the history of free trade or freedom of the seas, why don't we go back and look at its origins in the Indian Ocean as opposed to, the Roman Empire, which actually created free trade, but the Roman Empire only provided free trade to Roman citizens, meaning that they were conquered territories. In Indian Ocean, there was no empire in big way. The big empires of Indian Ocean, like the Mughal Empire, never extended their jurisdiction to the sea. So this is another example of, I'm not saying you neglect the Roman Empire and only focus on Indian Ocean. But why don't we look at different traditions, different sources of origins of what is a fairly universal concept like freedom of speech? So if you go to Africa, you'll find that there are, we think about anti-slavery and human rights charters. We talk about Magna Carta as sources of human rights, sources of humanitarian principles. But in the Empire of Mali, which was one of the largest empires of its time, the Mali Empire also had something called the Manden Charter, Kurukan Fuga, and they had very, very specific rules about how you treat your slaves, how you treat foreigners, how you property rights, and nobody knows about it. So the Africans actually sometimes are dismissed for not creating big empires, which is not true. Unlike the Eurasian or European empires, they had empires, they had very well-organized trading systems. They also had principles of humanitarian principles, principles of rights and wrongs that one could draw on. So if you go back to look at the pre-Columbian Americas, the Iroquois, Iroquois in North America, they had very specific rules about war and peace, which really operated in what is the northern kind of New York area and southern Canada, Ontario area of the United States. Those Iroquois nations actually regulated their relations in a way that has been said that their system of maintaining independence but still interacting with each other within a agreed framework was one of the inspirations for the U.S. Constitution. And then you go to the South America, the Inca and the Maya civilizations. They also had very specific and very concrete rules about governance and justice. Not all of them may be relevant today, but many of them are very, very relevant. For example, how do you deal with subjected or conquered people? Don't, like the Incas, had the policy of not totally observing or destroying conquered territories, but trying to actually incorporate them in a much more humane way by keeping their rulers, not interfering with their local gods and customs, and giving them autonomy in a way that they become loyal subjects of the empire rather than sources of rebellion. So you can learn them from the Inca civilization. I'm not trying to say all the non-Western civilizations are good. No civilization is perfectly good or perfectly bad. All civilizations have attraction and ugliness. But what we try to do, same true of Western civilization, we try to find out how concepts we take for granted as European, but actually have more universal origins. And the Europeans might have learned from those ideas. So Islam is another great example. Islamic civilization at its height actually was a major source of not only scientific knowledge, but also philosophical knowledge. Medicine was important. Art, perspective art, the science of perspective art came out of Islamic civilization. But philosophical doctrines about the creation of the world, that it was not created only or by God, but by natural forces, or it predated God's intervention, actually is a Greek idea that was developed much further by the Islamic scholars like Ibn Rushd, for example. So what we see here is there is connectivity in the flow of ideas. And when the Islamic civilization scholars philosophers developed it, they passed it to the Europeans. In Paris, for example, European professors, who then used those ideas for eternity of the world, that the universe was not created by God in a single act, but actually created by natural forces predating God. That was very helpful to European philosophers in challenging the authority of the church and creating a more rational and secular field of understanding. So I'm giving you many examples. From India, you can look at the ideas of King Ashoka, the moral doctrines of King Ashoka that rule by morality and compassion rather than by conquest, as one of the very few examples where a victorious ruler, emperor, totally gave off the use of force and never fought a war again. Or on the other side, you see the ideas of Kautilya, who talked about a realpolitik, how to conquer and create an empire. So same Indian civilization provides two contrasting ideas, what we today call idealism and realism in international relations. From China, you can look at also similar, both idealistic and realist ideas. The legalists talk about controlling subjects, maintaining discipline, and creating a stronger and powerful state with whatever means it takes. The Confucians, on the other hand, in China, talked about idealism, ruling by virtue rather than by force. So when we talk about international relations of realism, idealism, we talk about, as schools of thought. We talk about Immanuel Kant as idealist or Woodrow Wilson as an idealist. And when it comes to realists, talk about Machiavelli. These are important. But then there were Kautilya's before Machiavelli's. And there were Asokas before Kant. And so if you combine theory and practice, you'll find that many of the ideas we take it that we consider as universal attribute to Europe only actually have more universal origins. At the same time, some civilizations have given us distinctive ideas that we should be looking at. The Chinese had a very distinctive way of governing their country, our empire, and some of it is very, very useful today in looking at how to create a world order. The Chinese concept of, Tianxia, all under heaven. It has been criticized, but it is actually in some ways much more enlightening than the idea of the Westphalian state when he wants to create cooperation, because it talks about the equality of states. China is still at the higher level, but the other states are equal in the eyes of China. It's not a perfect solution to today's world, but China in reality could never be really dominant anyway. But the idea that other states can be more or less equal and they can coexist under the same sky is actually a very refreshingly enlightening idea that one should not completely dismiss just because it's coming from China. So I can give you many, many, many examples. The first peace treaty I mentioned earlier came from the Treaty of Kadesh between the Hittites and Egyptians. And you look at the Kadesh Treaty, a replica of that is actually in the United Nations headquarters in New York. You can find rules and principles that mimic, that predate, that presage contemporary rules of non-intervention, that one should not interfere in each other's affairs, or cooperation, how countries could cooperate, how one should even alliances, how to help each other if you're attacked. So again, another example, the great power diplomacy. Talk about the League of Nations, or the United Nations P5, and the League of Nations equivalent of that. The great powers have a special responsibility in managing global peace and cooperation. Well, look at the Amarna system, which was during the New Kingdom of Egypt, middle of the second millennium BC. The great powers of the region, including Egypt, but the Hittite and Babylon, Assyria, they cooperated to maintain peace and order through mutual understanding. And the great powers are managing the affairs of the entire Near East or the neighborhood in a way that really predates and presages the concept of Europe. Now, I'm not saying all these things are similar exactly. Some things happened thousands of years ago. But I think one should think that, we may have prototypes. We may have a sort of a similar, if not the same, institutions and practices of order building, organizing what we call international relations from the history of many parts of the world. So the idea is to bring them into our textbooks, make people aware and conscious, but we don't do that. We just simply think everything started with Europe, Westphalia, and it became global because of colonialism and decolonization. Sorry, it's a long way of answering your question. I hope, one could make sense of the meaning of what I was saying. And certainly there are many examples of the practices of international relations and the concepts of international relations from multiple civilizations.
Professor, this was a fascinating, albeit very rapid journey around the world, around this civilization at different times in our history, in common history of humankind, contributed idea that sometimes we find emerging in other civilization at different times. Whether or not there was migration of ideas, whether or not there was contagion of ideas, this is a fact. And thank you for giving us so many concrete examples, not just the theoretical thought about it. Now, back to the West. We went around the world. We're back to the starting point where we began the conversation at the West. Then the question arises, what made it so that the West had such an imprint, such a dominant effect on the development of IR as we know it now? And second question that comes from that is, how is this global order still basically functioning in this way, whereas one would assume that it's now urgent to transcend this, Western-centric perspective and involve more, go in the practice of global pluralism. How is that possible?
So since I gave you a long answer to the previous question, I'll give a short answer to this question. First, the first question is, how did international relations come to be so dominated by the West? So there are two quick reasons for it. Two reasons I'll put quickly. One is that international relations emerged as a discipline when the West was dominant. So the answer is power. So, you look at 1919, when the first chair of international relations was established, much of the world was still under colonial rule. This is just after World War I. So effect of World War I were there. Many of the empires have been weakened, but it was nothing like World War II when Europe was really weakened. So World War I was still at a time when we still have a lot of colonies. Britain was still the largest colonial power. India was still a British colony. So international relations emerges at a time when West is so dominant. And there is a clear link between power and knowledge. So, knowledge in not only international relations, but also generally in social sciences, is always associated with who is the most powerful. So it was not a coincidence that the first chair of international politics was established in Britain, which was technically, though weakening, still kind of the most powerful nation globally. This is before the U.S. replaced Britain. So then what happens after World War II, United States becomes the dominant power in the world, and international relations, the gravitas of the development of IR moves from Britain to the United States. And then the United States had the most institutions, departments, and knowledge production in IR in the U.S. itself. So American social science, as Professor Stanley Hoffman from Harvard put it, international relations becomes an American social science. So the key point is that there is a nexus between power and knowledge. So West was dominant, and West had the ability to put its ideas and practices into the body of literature of IR. The second thing about why IR becomes dominated by the West is because it's the reproduction, not the production, but the reproduction of knowledge through our curriculums, our universities. Many universities in the West are still very heavily, staffed or taught by Western professors, in fact, white professors. And there's not much diversity in the IR departments in the top universities around the world, in the West in particular. I'm not talking about around the world. So that's true of Europe as well as the United States. And it tends to, that sort of same Western-centric knowledge gets reproduced through programs. Like if you want to do a PhD in the United States, in the university, you have to pass a test or exam called comprehensive exam. And if you look at the syllabus of the comprehensive exam, it's the same thing that professors read and passed, and they sort of use that to test and pass or fail their own students. So knowledge gets reproduced, and these are very Western-centric traditional IR literature. So that's the kind of answer to the first question. It's the role of power, but also the institutional practices in universities and academia in the West that reproduces Western dominance. Why we need to change that? That's your second question. So if we want to change this, and that's what the global IR tries to do, if it's going to make international relations less dominated by the West, why we need to do that and how we do that. Okay, why we do that is because the world is changing. The Western dominance is fading. So, if you want to be a practitioner, diplomat, and making sense of the world today, you really need to know a lot about countries like China, like India, like Turkey, like South Africa, like Brazil, than you need to know about Europe or Ukraine, with due respect. Because, a very good example would be who are the top 10 economies in the world. China is already number 2 economy in the world. Japan is number 3. And India has replaced Britain as the number 5 economy. So among the top 5 economies in the world, aside the United States and Germany, 2, and the other 3 are sort of non-Western countries. So the economic power is shifting. Military power is still concentrated in the United States a bit, but Asian countries now spend more money than European countries on defense. So again, power is shifting there as well. So for a very practical reason, even if you're not interested in anything else, but just to know what is going on, and you want to train yourself, train your students in understanding the change in the world that is happening, you need to know more about non-Western countries, their ideas, their contributions. So it is really in your interest, in the interest of the Western countries, to know about this. The other thing is, of course, we can find better solutions to the problems. So there are so many ideas and contributions out there that if you can actually use them productively, you can actually have better results. So for example, if you say human rights came out of Europe and everybody else will follow that, now you are always immediately going to antagonize a lot of non-Europeans or non-Westerners. But if you say human rights have origins, which is factually true, because it depends on how you define human rights. Human rights, even as property rights, have origins in multiple civilizations. It came from Asia as much as Africa. Then you are going to shame them into in a sense that, you don't violate human rights because you are part of its creation, it's part of its heritage. So it's much more meaningful tactically as a strategy of operationalization than just, talking about human rights or anything else coming from Europe and having everybody expecting everybody to follow it. So we need to do that. How we do this is, again, I think to me, education is absolutely key. I'm a UNESCO chair in Transnational Challenges and Governance, and UNESCO's mission is education. And I think we need to look at curriculums. We need to look at how the subject of diplomacy, international relations, and all related fields, even history and social sciences in general, are taught. We need to revise curriculums and revise the way things are taught, the materials that we use to teach students. And that's a much more difficult thing because it takes a lot of effort. Again, people go for the easy way. Current professors go for the easy way. They kind of find it easy to draw on the same literature and reproduce it rather than really, write something completely new or teach something completely new. But we still need to create a movement, create consciousness that the world is changing, and we need to train our students in a very different way and in a broader way. That's what global international relations tries to do, and we need a lot more work. Hopefully, podcasts like this will be helpful in creating that kind of an awareness. So we need to tell our audience, either the students or our practitioners, that broadening our sourcing of international relations concepts or diplomatic concepts and ideas is not just a moral thing. It's actually a necessity because you can't cope with the 21st century with 18th century ideas or 17th century ideas.
Professor, this is certainly something that resonates with us here in the UN as we look at rising global problems and organizations, procedures, even set of ideas that clearly need to be upgraded to face those kind of problems. As we go towards wrapping up this podcast, I wanted to ask you a final question, which is we talked about pluralism, deep pluralism. We talk about global IR as an emerging trend, an emerging, hopefully, force for change. So when we look at that change, if we focus for a second on that change that we see emerging now, and on the other hand, we look at the rapidity of how global problems get together and sort of interact and become even bigger problems for facing humankind. I wonder if you could give us your opinion. Are we going to be better equipped in the future to tackle these problems because of this emerging and developing better understanding of global IR? And can we be optimistic, after all, about the future of multilateralism?
Well, it is hard to be optimistic at this point of time, given all those things that are going on in the world. But I think in the long term, we can be optimistic. A key point I like to make is that widening and broadening not only the academic study of international relations or teaching is good, but also using ideas and practices from different parts of the world and finding a common ground is actually good for peace and multilateralism. So I think time has come to widen our horizons, listen to other voices, understand the history of others, not because it's the right thing to do morally, but it's actually necessary. Now, as we certainly, we may not think globalization, the way it was hyped before, is going to continue. It was never really and as broad-based as some people made it out to be. But certainly the world is closer in terms of communication and transport, at least, than ever before. So we cannot divide the world into like the spheres of influence, or at least geographic entities which don't interact with each other the way the situation was a long time ago. Even the so-called medieval early modern times, the world was actually more linked than we know, we acknowledge. But still, we are definitely going to live in a world that is connected and that is, if not interdependent in the traditional sense, but certainly certain problems like climate change, pandemics, they can come out of one country, but they can spread very quickly and affect everybody in the world. And no single country can handle them. No single country, how much powerful, can actually manage climate change or manage pandemics or migration or refugees. So if we acknowledge that, then the need for global international relations become quite evident. So how can we manage global problems, or what I call transnational problems, in ideas and knowledge coming out of only one country or one region, or whether it's the United States or Europe? We need to really then look for solutions by looking at not only the contributions of different countries and ideas of different countries, both state and non-state actors, but also what sort of historical legacy, that historical ideas we can derive from their culture and history, through history. The idea of like a quarantine that was so central to managing COVID is actually came out of the Islamic civilization. Just think about a very simple, basic idea of quarantine, which was more effective than masks or medicine, at least the early stages of the pandemic, the COVID-19. A very good example of how ideas which are very ahead of their time, at that time, we should judge ideas in terms of their time and space, and not say something is out of date today. But actually, a lot of ideas came at a time when they were the most advanced ideas of that time. But some ideas retained their validity. I mean, the number 0 was invented in India. It hasn't lost any of its validity in the 21st century, no matter how sophisticated computers we may have. So if you take into account this and really, to the best possible extent, we can really mine this ideas and contributions and bring them together as some sort of a consolidated form and apply them to practical problems, the global challenges in particular, then we actually are we should be much better able to face global challenges. Nothing is going to be perfect, but I think ultimately the future of our ability to meet with the challenges of the 21st century is going to depend on drawing on ideas and contributions of multiple civilizations, rather than insisting that everything came out of the Europeans or the Americans and we should just follow those ideas and formulas.
Well, Professor, I was about to ask you what would be your final thoughts for our audience, but I think this really makes it the wisest point that you made, and I would like to conclude on that one, and I hope that this is portable and memorable for our audience. So, Professor Acharya, thank you so much for being with us on this episode. It was fascinating to follow you around the world and learn so much about the contribution that so many civilizations have made to the development of IR, and now our audience understands better global IR. Thank you so much for your time, for being
Thank you
with us.
very much. I really appreciate, Francesco, you inviting me to this podcast, and it's a real privilege to be part of the UN archives, especially having global IR enter into the your system of podcasts. So I hope this will help to promote the understanding of global IR.
Thank you so much.